or How to Count Dialogically. Para começar essa conferência, vamos chamar inicialmente a mediadora Nicole Mione-Cern, para compor a mesa. Nicole é aluna de doutorado do programa de pós-graduação em Linguística e Língua Portuguesa da Unesp de Araraquara. Ela desenvolve, sob a orientação da professora Luciane de Paula, a pesquisa Canções Cinematográficas, Análise Dialógica do filme musical Letras, com financiamento do CNPq. Durante os meses de maio a agosto de 2017, ela efetuou estágio em Nova York, no Graduate Center da University of New York, com bolsa CAPES IV SIED, sob orientação do professor Peter Hitchcock. Concluiu o mestrado no programa de pós-graduação em Linguística e Língua Portuguesa da Unesp de Araraquara, com financiamento da CNPq. Foi graduado em Letras, licenciatura plena em Língua Portuguesa e Alemã e respectivas literaturas pela Unesp, Faculdade de Ciências e Letras de Assis. Desenvolveu durante a graduação, sob orientação da professora Luciane de Paula, com o financiamento da FAPESP, um projeto de pesquisa de iniciação científica intitulado Moça com Grupo de Pelo, Diálogos Possíveis, em que pesquisou o discurso do filme a partir dos estudos dos círculos de bakhtiniana e de
Bom, vamos receber agora então o professor Peter Hitchcock. O professor Peter Hitchcock é professor no Baruch College e no Graduate Center da University of New York. Hitchcock também faz parte das faculdades de Women's Studies e Film Studies no Graduate Center e é atualmente diretor do Center for Place, Culture and Politics. É autor de 7 livros, incluindo Labor and Culture, The New Public Intellectual, The Long Space, Imaginary States, Oscillate Wildly e Dialogically of the Oppressed. Entre suas publicações, as pesquisas de Hitchcock se encontram em revistas e antologias importantes na área de literatura e estudos culturais. Entre seus próximos trabalhos está incluída a pesquisa The Spheres of Place, para uma antologia em teoria pós-colonial, e um livro sobre os mundos do pós-colonialismo e literatura do mundo. Ele atualmente pesquisa um trabalho que justapõe cultura da mercadoria com instrumentos financeiros, Trading Objects. Hitchcock recebeu diversas bolsas e prêmios de pesquisa. Ele viveu e trabalhou na China e em Taiwan. Diversas de suas palestras e entrevistas se encontram online e ele também já foi visto e escutado na TV e no rádio e ministrou palestras ao redor do mundo. Agora vamos receber então o professor Peter Hitchcock.
This paper will be in English. English.
Desculpa, só um momento. Quem vai ficar nos slides? Os slides aqui estão em português, aqueles que o professor pediu para que traduzíssemos, alguns não estão, mas a maioria está traduzido.
So, one dimension of the work that we do is to think through the connections and disjunctions between what counts as cultural work and the work of culture through and as specific economic relations. Think of this as an animating Geist or spirit in the brief discussion that follows, with all of the hazards of anything vaguely Hegelian in that invocation. Because time's arrow is aiming for my heart and your patience, I'm going to restrict my comments to 4 dimensions of financialization in the current conjuncture, while attempting along the way to indicate some of the more detailed bakhtinian theorization that would accompany it. First, an obvious point, or at least to me. If, as Marx argued, capitalism is essentially a revolutionary system of economic exploitation, its crises must be thought simultaneously as terminal and regenerative. The second, financialization was not invented ex nihilo from nothing. after the collapse of Bretton Woods. It must therefore be read in terms of its historicity, its temporality, and not simply as an epiphenomenon of last week or the insouciant now. The reduction to the present without context or history participates in capitalism's comportment. It ideologically disables a deeper engagement with the substance of economic logic and the problem of futurity for capitalism. Third, cultural critics love the fact that finance might need dialogic imagination. Surely, therefore, it is easily mapped onto all that we do in literature or film or a plethora of other cultural forms. Because I cannot let go of this idea, the idea that we can do something useful in this regard. The Laffer curve as lyric, poetics of prop trading, and the neat formulation of fictions of finance. I participate in a will to culturalism in the face of economic abstraction. So what? This might require further elaboration below. Finally, while there are several subjects of finance subject to finance, how does one approach a kind of cultural agency before finance, as that which constitutes a notable component of its suppression or disruption? The pithiness of the question that I've asked in other places and spaces, how do you fight an algorithm, masks several forms of cultural and political disruption. Horrifyingly, some of these are not necessarily new. But I would like to suggest, albeit very briefly on this occasion, that the chief weakness of anti-capitalism's critique of financialization is its incipient cultural gesturism. The production of a checklist that no one would dispute, but that largely leaves the logic of capital in place, and in some instances may actually expand its reach. Here perhaps we need to argue for a different emphasis in the cut between tactics and strategy of opposition in cultural analysis. Do we somehow doubt now, in the 21st century, that there is no literature that is not also about the economic conditions of its possibility? Is this still even a question? Clearly, the point is not that, but specific cultural heuristics. Yet capitalist hegemony is not exactly averse to having speech genres, so a critical pause is not unwarranted. The title of my talk is caught between counting and accounting. Numbers and narratives, which are themselves an antinomy of crass economic manipulation and the potentia, of fiction. I would just say as an aside that there's probably more that we can do with counting, counts and account in English than you might be able to do in Brazilian Portuguese. But one of the meanings of count that I think is very important and perhaps germane is to stand up and be counted. To stand up and be counted. And they don't have to tell Brazilians what that means in their current conjunction. The difference in counting and accounting is not simply one of degree or kind, but reflects necessarily on the scale of hermeneutics, between the event of finance and its temporal logic, the moment of assembly and the processes of assimilation, of Hegel. This, I might venture, is accounting as architectonics. But wait, bakhtiniana finance. Surely we can keep dialogic discourse closer to home. Home is where the fiction is. And leave finance to drown in its numbers and alienating abstractions. Since I have intimated connections and disjunctions, let me mention why the far away is so close on this occasion. Bakhtiniana's father, of course, was not only a product of non-titled nobility, but a bank manager. So the material basis of the Bakhtin family was finance. And although their relationship was not particularly robust, Mikhail Fedorovich was not beyond preaching the virtues of a financial future to his son, Mikhail. Indeed, these accountancy skills were put Bakhtin in relatively good stead during the time he served his sentence of exile in Kazakhstan, when he was forbidden for corrupting the youth by teaching literature, philosophy, or religion. Fortunately, I don't face those bans. While his wife, Elena Alexandrovna, worked for a period as a bookkeeper, cashier, in an office that administrated kolkhoz affairs. Obviously, this was collective agriculture trying to take place. In 1931, Bakhtin took up accounting by working in another office that calculated the extent to which Soviet farming reforms in the area were allowing agriculture to meet the overall government economic plan. Bakhtin tended to keep relationships formal, but he got on well with the Red partisans running Krasnodar, where he was exiled, especially because he now knew how to do financial bookkeeping. They rewarded him with cigarettes, although perhaps not enough given the burning Bildungsroman manuscript theory, and extra food and occasionally opportunities to lecture. If part of what I'm doing here is in the spirit of Bakhtin, think of it as the spectral Bakhtin, a way of reading the Bakhtinian binary Carol Emerson suggests. The Bakhtin who delivered a series of lectures under the title The Organization and Techniques of Commerce and the Annual Financial Plan. This is also the guy who did the dialogical imagination. As is well known, Bakhtin's only publication during this period appeared in 1934, not in Literaturny Kritik or Literaturna Ucheva, but in the massively influential periodical Soviet Trade. The article, experience based on the study of demand of kolkhoz workers, is odd for any number of reasons, not least of which is its generally favorable account of collectivization, and because it is cast against the backdrop of a massive famine in Kazakhstan caused by that very process in which upwards of 1.5 million Kazakhs starved to death. Clark and Holquist is a memorial of people who died during that famine. Clark and Holquist note that Bakhtin may not have been serious in this essay endeavor, and in addition, the famine was not as bad in his region, partly because of the presence of ethnic Russians. So we'll be very specific about who they wanted to starve to death. But for those of us who tend to materialize Bakhtin, the imbrication here of text and event is a little more than unfortunate. Obviously, the point is not that Bakhtin is culpable or answerable in a moment of genocide, but that all kinds of calculation should be figured into a dialogic account of otherwise aesthetic ideas. The article itself contains a sideward glance. Basically, do not trust the account I have given here, and thus may be deemed an example of failed accounting. Yet its impress, remember, I'm punning constantly on accounting, so accounting is to tell, to make a narrative, but it's also to correlate numbers. Yet its impress hovers at the edge of Bakhtin's livelihood, one which allows the word to live beyond its numbers. The financial, even in Bakhtin's intellectual biography, does not complete a false unity, but tends to undo it in advance, just as novelization, in its turn, displaces the financial in its own image. So, for now, let us say Bakhtin remains important because of, and despite the fact that financialization is now the meta-language of contemporary life, whether we want it or not. This university too runs on financialization. As Bakhtin tabled his numbers, he was also remarkably, in the circumstances, composing his major essays on the novel, now known in English as the Dialogical Imagination, around a working definition of genre as a consciously structured hybrid of languages. Holquist notes novel is the name Bakhtin gives to whatever force is at work within a given literary system to reveal the limits, the artificial constraints of that system. Literary systems are comprised of canons, and novelization is fundamentally anti-canonical. It will not permit generic monologue, unquote. Perhaps this is an explanation why monological finance gets novelized, but also why financial fictions throw the limits of literariness into relief. So one question is, can the novel account for accounting? Can it narrate a history or a discourse of numbers? From this one cannot distill the abrupt declaration, all finance is fiction, a violence to conceptual differentiation as well as to the materiality of Bakhtin's life. Yet it does suggest a pertinent dialectical tension, if not an historical antinomy, in the present. The novel portrays its historical possibility. It typifies Sedrukash, its absolute sinfulness. But fictions of finance do not prove such embedded textuality, or at least not alone, or under conditions of their own choosing, which is another lesson, of course, from Marx. But while Bakhtin and Elena purchase sustenance from their accounting, how might Bakhtin's essays written in the 30s bring perspective to such accounting? In the remarks added to the Chronotope essay, Bakhtin reminds us that he is keenly aware of the time space of narrative possibility. Bakhtin notes that in the novels of Stendhal and Balzac, salons and parlors materialize the new relations of the period, where political, business, social, literary reputations are made and destroyed. Careers are begun and wrecked. Here are decided the fates of high politics and high finance, as well as the success or failure of a proposed bill, a book, a play, a minister, a courtesan singer. Here in their full array that is brought together in one place at one time are all the gradations of the new social hierarchy. And here finally there unfold forms that are concrete and visible, the supreme power of life's new king, money. So Bakhtin realizes the oncoming of the world of finance from his position in the 1930s, but its history obviously is in the 19th century, which is what he's referring to in that particular articles. The chronotopes of finance have changed, of course, which the contemporary novel both mediates and metamorphosizes. But the point is that fiction does not proceed from the elation of the money form in daily life. Indeed, in order to elucidate the parodic stylization of professional discourses, Bakhtin provides the example of Dickens' Little Dorrit and the admirable Mr. Merdle, whose ability to coin money is only matched by the inability of everyone else to discern how he does it. Just that they should appreciate his, quote, gigantic combinations of skill and capital, unquote. Now, when one is in Bakhtin's life, one is not in the art he discusses. But time and again, Bakhtin considers the question of historical process in the novel as if it is a window to his own. In the same way that Thomas Piketty uses the fiction of Austin and Balzac to frame capital in the 21st century. Has anybody read that book by Piketty? I'm sure it's in Portuguese. It's translated into 20 languages. It's sort of a must-read to understand capitalism today, but from somebody who claims not to have read Marx. Bakhtin's critique of Merdle is salutary and pointed, as if it was conversing with his father, or at least a flawed version of a flawed version of Merdle himself. Bakhtin's reading of Stern's Iorque also ponders this Rabelaisian image of money and deceit. Another feature of what we might call credit and characterization is its ideological imprint, the play between intention and the concrete. Again, the question here is not about crude economic determinism, but of a mind struggling to negotiate the fraught space between the conditions of finance and the desire to assert the discursive centrality of the novel as genre, with the caveat that in terms of speech, the novel was for Bakhtin decidedly secondary. Now, rather than file this under the convenient Bakhtinianism of typical double-accented, double-styled hybridization, I prefer to read this as a constitutive challenge of meaning within heteroglossia. It is not that the revelation of finance makes for new content in the dour descriptions of money, men, and their infinite excess. It is that subsistence or social being recoils from any stress on the calculation, measuring narrative life. Such resistance is seen in Bakhtin's approach to the autobiography of Isocrates, and I quote, "A public accounting of a man's own life in the form of an apologia," unquote. I find this strangely regenerative of the, quote, grotesquely anachronistic influence of Bakhtin's thought, to borrow from Vitaly Maklin. So, on the one hand, in a longer version of the present essay, I attend to both the discourse of the novel of finance, but also the financial discourses of the novel. The latter is about the impress of calculation and number, and is an extension in turn of commodity critique, but the novel is also a commodity in the world market, particularly in the re-emergence of world literature coming to a library review. On the other hand, I'm concerned to elaborate the tensions between the event of financial crisis, particularly in 2007-2008, and a level of unfinalizability in its eventness, in which its openness is about persistence rather than a systematicity without end. I actually think in Brazil you understand quite well what I mean by this distinction in terms of the financialization of contemporary life, even though the effects here have been distilled more politically than economically. So, if we are familiar with the metaphors used to define finance, we are familiar with the metaphors used to define finance, and the most famous one is from Rolling Stone, by Matt Taibbi in 2010, that Goldman Sachs was a great vampire squid wrapped around the face of humanity, relentlessly jamming its blood funnel into anything that smells like money. This became the metaphor that stuck in understanding what finance had done to the world economy that produced the crisis in 2008. Accepting that the concept of humanity is also something of a vampire itself. I'm thinking here of Flusser and Beck's Vampire Tutis Infernalis. You guys probably all know Flusser, right? He lived here for a quarter century. This is one of the most bizarre philosophical texts in the history of philosophy. Keep in mind too that I'll say this again, but the Vampire Tutis Infernalis, literally the vampire from hell, does not actually suck blood. What stretches financialization is both its soft body and its extensive hydrostatic musculature. Its protein substance is well suited to movement and malevolence. Financialization has earned well its metaphors, for it is monstrous in much more than numbers, yet it is not the id of capitalism. It's more like its objectivia, right, from that on. Striated surfaces of circulation split off from its appearance as a subject that can never be one in itself, because it cannot metonymically replace value in extraction and exchange with pure fictiveness. Capital at some point must realize value. It must realize value at some point. It can't all be fictive, otherwise capitalism will collapse, as this building is real. So the vampire cannot give blood instead of sucking it, or at least not for long. This we might call an accumulation axiom before the biological fact, since the squid in question, as I said, does not actually suck blood at all. Now, I don't have much time to make more of the psycho-intersectionality of financialization and the objectivia as desire, but the idea at least is to engage the accumulation strategies of finance as a kind of capitalist jouissance, a correlative dialectically with the overcoming of alienation by labor in the jouissance called revolution. Even if one is no longer inclined to read Zizek, in America we're not allowed to read Zizek anymore. It would be interesting to consider Tomsik's intervention in this regard, the capitalist unconscious, alongside a more literary critical example, say Anna Cornblue's position on Victorian metalepsis, and I quote briefly. The critique of fictitiousness disappeared when the construct of an inner psychic economy realized capital. Okay, so before turning back to the points I initially raised, I should say something more about event and eventness in this schema. There is a certain wariness about events and their logic. An event in the global south can often mean spectacular violence visited upon it, which, while demonstrably traumatic, tends to rely on the many ways in which slow violence, to borrow from Rob Nixon's word, structures everyday life. Indeed, in a period of intense American narcissism, events only seem to take place if they are connected to or can be reflected on directly as a consummately American concern. This we might call sort of the Trump imperative. You guys aren't up for humour this morning. I know I'm following some beautiful music. Beautiful music. I mean, I don't know whether my mind is cello or jello. You got that one. Still, a little US centrism must be better than Hegel in the world historical, right? Or Alain Badiou's mind-numbing exploitation of event through post-Kantorian set theory. Please solve by the end of the lecture. If you could figure out what he's trying to say there, you're a better person than me. There'll be a special prize. I'll give you a book of Badiou. So, it's a calculation that in his philosophical work leaves us with very few events to calibrate being. So he does construct events from this mathematics, but they're principally the ones that we all know, like 1789, 1917, 1968, etc. Deleuze's thoughts on Chronos and Ion seem succinct, although predictably perhaps give us an abstract moment endlessly decomposing itself that makes bankruptcy almost cheery by comparison. The event is an invitation to theory, and it is important to think financialization through it. On the whole, the event of finance is not a bond issue, an IPO or an ICO, an initial coin offering, a tax law, which is generally in its own subcategory marked catastrophe, or a put order. The event of finance is crisis, a probability clause built into its logic, part of long cycles like conjugative waves, or short ones, speculative bubbles, defaults, flash crashes, and the like. The shifting scales of finance have a massive influence on economic decision, and to those of us in literary study, lend themselves not so much to form, accepting the general confusion between fiction and fictiveness, as in Marx's disposition on fictive capital, but to genre. Indeed, a good deal of what we think of as critical finance studies is galvanized by literary approaches to the time space of the generically financial. From Mary Poovy's genres of the credit economy to a plethora of critique on financial fictions, including work that influences mine by Champoil, McClanahan, Laberge, Haven, and Martin. Such studies, build your library. Such studies often find the event of finance in its crises and key theoretical inspiration in Frederick Jameson's essay from the 90s, Culture and Finance Capital. Initially playing on Giovanni Arrighi's spiral model of capitalist development, a discontinuity in time and space, Jameson sees the financial as more viral in its logical mediation. The problem of such abstraction is that, as Jameson points out, it must be grasped in its cultural expressions, precisely because at base it is otherwise unrepresentable. Given that Jameson's essay appears both before the bursting of the dot-com bubble and the financial crisis of 2008, I read it once more à la Bakhtin as grotesquely anachronistic. Yet also and similarly deeply prescient in terms of its methodological implications. Here is not the place to reconcile a dialectician with a dialogician, with me presumably as the diamagician. But the event and eventness of finance requires at once this kind of congruent impossibility. The violence of number does not readily submit to the waywardness of the word, even though, like class, they both intersect in sign. This clash or struggle Jameson signifies by the use of the Deleuzian term, deterritorialization, which both captures the rhizomatic travels of financial instruments, but severely underestimates their materialization in place, where a bond, a mortgage, or rent stands for the place you inhabit. The majority of people in advanced capitalist economies live either by the mortgage or by rent. The metonymic function is very much where words substitute for number in the real financialization putatively represents. So, literary critics have been very good in demystifying the shibboleth of financialization, both in its obfuscation and abstraction, and in blasting through its continuum to the hurt its history makes. So Annie McClanahan, a colleague of mine in particular, has been pointed in her elaboration of a critique of financialization from below. In American studies, from Dreiser's The Financier to the movie Drag Me to Hell, has anybody seen that? Oh, you have to see that, man. You can stream it for free. Portuguese subtitles. It's amazing what happens when you misbehave as somebody who originates mortgages. You get dragged to hell. Analysis has been enlivened by a cogent cultural understanding of financial binds. So in order to address temporal fictions, let us consider further the logic of finance in its event, for which I would use the term eventness. Right? So in his book, Capital of the Time, Konings reads financial temporality as plastic, which of course used to refer to slivers of debt production, credit cards, but now in an era of phone finance alludes to a certain unfixedness of economic relations, an indeterminateness in tune with flexible accumulation. Plasticity here owes something to the work of Malraux and her reading of Hegel. Among other insights, Konings points to the neoliberal finance governance as being stitched together by speculation, bailout, and austerity. The event of 2008, the financial crisis as deep as any witnessed since the Great Depression, is the primary evidence for such governance, or perhaps more pointedly, governmentality, particularly regarding the processes of restitution. Even if we are not all late Victorians, as Foucault once contended, we are all late Foucauldians, and perhaps we are very late Deleuzians before ever later capitalism. Capitalism is now 500 years old. What, however, will be the eventness of such a crisis? Eventness, in my interpretation, is an abstract obligation to accumulation, close to what Randy Martin calls moneyness. It attempts to understand the underlying temporality enmeshed in a long durée of financial instruments. Derivatives, which Martin usefully reminds us, derives from the French derive, overflowing banks. So he's punning on banks. Banks of the river, banks where you get your money. The difference would be that whereas Martin stresses the rupture that results, eventness also considers extension or the persistence of certain fundamentals that permit financialization to proceed. I must say it is not anti-capitalist to be linear averse, since capitalism, like us, is compelled to jumble time in the face of counterfactual exploration. Now, in what Ivan Asher calls a portfolio society, the value derived from information on which financialization must pivot does not permit the derivative itself to dominate. The time of capital is part of a speculative desire, but its historical manifestations overdetermine the portfolio rather than rationalize a mania in a single key. Think of Bitcoin. Does anybody own any Bitcoin here? Come on, own up. Although I've already written on Bitcoin but the Bitcoin itself is a moving horizon. You think you've said something good about it, and then it mutates. This, for me, is part of a much longer argument developed elsewhere. Anyway, in Bitcoin, the real players are not the scratch card scroungers or retiree gamblers, still less the hipster punting on an ATM withdrawal, but the account holders who keep their keys off the internet entirely, sometimes in vaults, and they pump and dump using algorithms rather than win. The only way to make real money with Bitcoin is to keep your ID key off the internet, because anything that's on the internet is going to be purloined. Of course, the security and securitization often comes with spending other people's money. This is why finance studies one must resist the temptation to label financialization itself as primarily speculation or gambling. It's not quite that when it's not your money. It's gambling when you use your own money. It's jouissance when you use somebody else's. Just give me some money and I'll show you. The vampire squid then lives in the time of other people's moneyness. So, this was my attempt to show you a squid eating money, but unfortunately it's a little amateur, sorry. In short, eventness invokes Bakhtin's sense of code being as that process or logic producing the substance of the event. So part of what I do in finance studies is to track the ontological consistency of the accumulating I. This is not strictly an ontological pluralism, relevant for instance in Latour's technicist multiplication, but a +1 relationality that does not reduce financialization to the individual, like Davos man, or a rogue trader like Nick Leeson. Such an approach to the meaning of finance is problematic, of course, since event for Bakhtini includes utterance, and the violence of financialization is as much about what it does not say. But how can co-being as transaction be thought through the points where I began? We're getting there. Within capitalist cycles, financialization, raising capital through end-to-end prime, is hardly unusual. What is constitutive is not simply a rhyming of history. But the crisis of 2008 was in part produced by a marked intensification of its impress upon transnational banking. The regenerative aspect that I mentioned at the beginning pre-exists the crisis itself, not just through the annulment of what's called the Glass-Steagall Act, which allowed the imaginative repurposing of bank deposits and reserves, but in the complex confluence of digitization and mathematical hedging that had begun with computational financing from the early 1950s, through to the advent of option pricing and mortgage securitization in the early 70s, when of course Black-Scholes financial modeling first appeared. So when I was studying economics as an undergraduate, this was very much part of the discourse. So, the transition that became characteristic of CDOs or collateralized debt obligations allowed for the calculation of profit on what would otherwise be considered a debt pledge. At its most obscene, it facilitated the production of the ninja present strategy. See, ninja, no job, no income, no assets. So you have nothing, and they allow you to buy a house. This is a recipe for disaster. Why would they do it? Because each time they do this loan, they get a fee. The fee is separate from what is over the loan, except because they can always claim the house as an asset. This is called going underwater. Lots of people underwater, so it's kind of financing. I myself am a ninja. That's why I dress it black. The prehistory of the crisis, as well as its effects, might usefully be termed its eventness, and draws in other aspects of capitalist history, both the mutations of the money form that Koning's details, but also the co-presence or co-being of its materialization. Obviously, this is another window on the problem of value in Marxist history, for which a much more detail are required. So co-being is often when the fictive becomes fiction, which which is to say that novelization is much more amenable to the social dimensions of bonds and debt. The divisions that also overdetermined the racism of redlining, the boys' club of investment banks, and the emergence of the French quant. This is actually a thing that the French are much better at quant analysis than any other nation. Who knew the French were so good at science? C'est bizarre. Neoliberal economic reasoning often reasons from a basic autonomy or for Koning's autopoiesis. The point of context is not simply some anthropological thickening of description, even as it challenges the platitudes of circus reading, which is very hot now in the United States, but to use a little more hesitant history regarding catastrophism and endism, where capitalism is concerned. True, hyperbole may be necessary where the environment is concerned, even more than Naomi Klein's. But continually announcing the death throes of capitalism, the terminal crisis, as Giovanni Arrighi once put it, can disable opposition that might otherwise hasten its demise. The durée in longue durée is also about durability. The bond, let's say, as instrument. It is paradoxical to some that financial futures, which were also introduced in the 1970s, hold the present to ransom, but this also figures the vexed temporalities of finance. Winding down position steals time from the present, but simultaneously draws time from the future. In the States, obviously, there's $1.3 trillion in student debt. And so students have already mortgaged their future because that debt doesn't go away in American law. It follows you until you expire. You can't escape student debt by declaring bankruptcy. So all other forms of debt you can, but student debt for some reason sticks. This is a massive attack on the youth of the United States. So, at a practical level, confiscating assets and annulling contracts in the name of the commons will take time, and the abolition of property laws underwritten by finance may not persuade the workers to part with their mortgages. This is yet one more reason, Parker Jameson, that the end of capitalism is harder to imagine than the end of the world. So, what's literature's answer to this sordid time space, this chronic chronotype of capitalism? Well, most of the time it's dogged by description and relatively revelatory realism. Schonkweiler and LaBerge are right to read abstraction as a mediating force between the two, but there are other ways to enjoin imagination in both the understanding and displacement of finance's grip on contemporary life. Arjun Appadurai, for instance, takes the position that whatever else it is, the crisis of 2008 was primarily a failure of language, which puts those of us in the language arts in an oddly defensive position. I don't know if anybody's read this book, Banking on Words, but it's analysis of the language used in derivative finance. You must wonder what I read at night. That is until you read the argument itself, which uses the idea that contract language that has entered a world of pure deconstruction, and that derivatives are but flighty signifiers in search of further displacement and deferral where value realization is due. So Appadurai says more than that, of course, but it's been long known that the infamous derivative is a post-structuralist dream in which settlement becomes yet one more contract in a seemingly endless chain of empirical disavowal. So, 2 points are germane. First, the financier is little worried by notional value. If over-the-counter derivatives are the world's biggest shell game, with a current notional value of around $550 trillion, it's hard to think of numbers that big, but if we sold everything, if we put a price on everything that we know of on the planet, that would only come to about $80 trillion. So the derivatives market is by a factor of 8 or 9 larger than everything that could be priced. But they're not interested in that. The financiers are interested in the gross market value of about $12.7 trillion. Because those are attached to real value. So this is a graph that tracks the real value of derivatives rather than the notional value, which is the mind-blowing number, is the notional value. These dollars back assets, and while each of these may have their own shell game built in, there is a signified at stake. Second, and perhaps more importantly, nobody denies that hucksterism has its language. That the financial crisis exploded around the lives of real people, not just slippery semantics. Homelessness and destitution precipitated by individual financial instruments like the subprime mortgage were remedied to some degree, a small one to be sure, but the fact remains that the social effects of the crisis are not best addressed by a kind of semantic stress test around contractual language. John Lanchester's book, How to Speak Money, think of a bakhtiniana title, Discourse in Finance. It's wrong for other reasons when it comes to the financial crisis. From the role of central banks to the basis of institutional reform and even how to interpret the global reduction in child mortality. But the lexicon, I would argue, is far better at demystifying the obscurantism of lingua pecunia. Indeed, and perhaps oddly, in that role it enjoins a more general decolonizing of financial globalization that has implications for consciousness raising and political opposition. For eventness also means joining effects and causes. So this leads me to a couple of other remarks on the critique of fictions of finance and the anachronistically discursive. Obviously, from the text I've already mentioned, the wheel here is not in need of reinvention, but let's back up for a moment. Bonds, for instance, are issued as a debt to whoever pays for them. Corporations and states issue bonds in order to function, and they tie or bond entities together. If there is a certain bond language, a contractual discourse is bound to emphasize obligation, a responsibility that is simultaneously fiscal and social. This is not an answerability as such, but an injunction to become answerable. When Alan Greenspan, the former Federal Reserve Chairman, famously opined on irrational exuberance, he was not only remarking on speculative zeal, greed is good mentality, a Geister gecko from the movie Wall Street, this Michael Douglas, but also on a responsibility sufficient to honor contracts. Remember, that was his motto, greed is good. There are quite a few people who believe that. Even 10 years on from the crisis of 2008, faced by another Fed chairman, even 10 years on in the crisis, faced by another Fed chairman, Ben Bernanke, there is still some debate about whether traders knew they would not be on the hook if their credit default swaps themselves defaulted. The bailout and moral hazard requires a separate argument, but clearly if financial crisis is punitive, it is comparatively less so for those who compose its instruments or who misuse them than it is for those who are putatively the objects and benefactors of such instruments. So at least in the 2008 crisis, they didn't go to jail. But people were made homeless. The ostensible asymmetries of financial hegemony are being opposed. Resistance through strike debt, jubilee, austerity rights, occupations, squats, including those in Sao Paulo, are all inspiring markers of the violence of finance as a radical fruit. And financialization in its eventness reveals something of the logic adequate to its overcoming. Yet, in the desire for value extraction, not speculation, financialization must seek new victims and new ways to provide succor to its squid-like offspring called shareholders or stakeholders. This places significant pressure on the validity claims of intersubjectivity and solidarity, if not the victims who must potentially bind from it. We have then an eventness of bonds against bonds, of two forms at a minimum of ties that bind. And playing on bond as both a financial instrument and something that links people together in solidarity, or bond into one. The question of agency is not only about forms of insurrection, sabotaging servers, or hacking the financial system, but of the principle of absolute universality that would ground its transformation. Obviously, this principle requires elaboration beyond my gloss on bakhtinian concepts, but I would like to think that if financialization survives in its accumulation, It is in part because it obfuscates the eventness and not just the descriptive events of the crisis in which it takes place. Its power is also the power to diminish the contours of universal possibility. The eventness already contains the thought of its event, which is why when we think of financial crisis, we might usefully consider the logic of event that attends it. Since this is an opening onto cultural critique, let me conclude last paragraph with a couple of observations on counting dialogically. So, if in Bakhtin we understand novelization as doubly syncretic, both in the becoming novel and in the critique that is adequate to it, in finance we continually meet the resolutely synthetic instruments that are opportunistically accumulative like the synthetic bond, which emulates the characteristics of the instruments it combines without actually being reducible to them. This is not a Gramscian rectangle, but it's what happens when you drink too much cachaça. Again, I would point to the necessary distinction between fiction and fictive, which is what this is attempting to demonstrate. Novels at best transcribe the conditions of financial synthesis, and no amount of double voicing can actually meet the narratology of number, either by speed or by syntax. But this is also the force of novelistic inscription, because to count dialogically is to interrogate the terms of co-being, simultaneity, and synthesis, even as their internal contradictions refuse all manner of homology, metaphors, and poetics in general. Nothing epitomizes such a critical challenge like the derivative, whose relation of relations seems to extinguish the relation called social from its calculation. The derivative lives according to a specific time-space of velocity and volatility. It is true that derivative trading creates volatility, and while I would like to think it is a correlative of excitable speech in the work of G. Butler, its logic of event is demonstrably ab-negative at the level of contemporary intersubjectivity. In part, the difference is computational and code-specific. We might call this algorithmic abjection. In fact, I'll be selling t-shirts after this talk with that. But obviously, it also has to do with the manner in which we think existence. Holquist and Emerson recognized that the syncretic brilliance of Bakhtin rests in his capacious appreciation of the absolute novelty of the novel. One is struck immediately by the paradox of attempting such assignation to the derivative. How can a derivative be absolutely novel? From the word, right? It derives from something. It's always derivative. It can't be novel. Perhaps this explains why books about the derivatives, are so preternaturally novelistic. For instance, Edward Lee Poomer's recent book, The Social Life of Financial Derivatives. I'm going to quote from that book and then close. The book has a narrative arc. He's describing his own book, but I want you to think novel, right? The book has a narrative arc, though the results unfold cumulatively like a set of transparencies that once laid one over the other produces a composite so that the succession of chapters throw light on one another. And the themes and counter-themes weave a more encompassing composition. In this composite image, the derivative represents and is the exemplar in the financial realm of the emergence of a transformed form of the social. In effect, we are still faced with the classic dialectical fix between what the social makes and derives and what narrative makes and derives, with a novelizing tilt that favors fiction over the fictive, a derivation, let us say, over absolution. For now, our financial fictions trade on derivatives. They wager that the discourse of the novel can capture the abstract equivalence of value in financial extraction. And thus non-fiction about finance often reads like derivative novels, or a scene of Myrtle's circumlocutions from Dickens that I mentioned earlier. My point is about whether the financial becomes a dialogical limit case, in which the novel both challenges the whole of finance in our everyday existence, and where the discourse of the novel precisely subtends a dialogical account of counting, even as counting provides, as it once did for Bakhtin, a material basis for syncretizing the magnanimity of novelistic discourse. So perhaps financial fictions will become a footnote to history, although probably a long one. Zia Haider Rahman's novel of finance, for instance, I don't know whether this has been translated in the light of what we know, contains an extensive and detailed footnote on synthetic securities. Indeed, Rahman's novel bathes us in the discourse of financialization. And for those of us already up to our necks in debt, perhaps this is a sufficiently rude awakening. For now, describability does the work of untranscribability, and so we may yet need an alternative discourse of what counts. Obrigado. Did anybody solve the mystery of the idea?
Thank you, professor. Nós vamos abrir agora um tempinho para 2 perguntas, sem muita extensão, em função do tempo. Alguém gostaria de fazer alguma pergunta?
I just want the t-shirts.
Já que não temos nenhuma pergunta, então vamos encerrar por aqui a conferência. Queremos dar alguns recados. Não esqueçam de trazer os seus copos na parte da tarde para poderem participar do café. Logo após o almoço, nós voltamos então com sessões de comunicação e também com cursos e oficinas. E também, para quem ficar aqui na faculdade, na hora do almoço, nós teremos uma sessão, algumas atividades de debates acontecendo aqui no auditório. Então, vocês estão todos convidados. Muito obrigada.